I've ever been in a pulpit. I have the desire, I suddenly have the desire to be evangelical. I think I'm a bit that way anyway, but I'm obviously going to get above myself here. Wow. I'd like to see it if there's anybody I can't see down there. I thought I'd start a little bit, but how we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for a little bit, I'm going to read a little bit of the sending, and then I'm going to see if you'd like to ask some questions in case I failed to answer a burning question. Well, you know, most of you, I think all of you know, that I started writing Obernewtyn when I was 14. And one of the questions I'm getting asked again and again is, aren't you bored with her by now? Aren't you sick of her? Haven't you grown out of her? I haven't, and I'm really gratified that you haven't, those of you who've actually grown up with me. I keep having people in suits looking, you know, like people who might be making a judgment against me or doctoring me or solicitoring me, coming up to me and saying, I read you when I was 12, when I was 7. In fact, when I was pregnant, my doctor said to me, my midwife, my gynecologist said to me, I'm sure I know your name. And I said, no, you wouldn't know me. Yeah, I'm sure your name really rings a bell. No, you wouldn't know me. Yeah, I'm sure. The Gathering. And I said, yeah, you've read that? He said, oh yes, I read it. He said, I was reading it one night when I should have been studying for an exam. And I said, it wasn't the gynecology exam. So he delivered my daughter just fine, so he must have done okay. And when people are buying the book now and saying to me, many of them, I've got exams next week, I say, don't read this book until you feel, I'm not going to be responsible for you failing in life. So I guess you are able to keep on reading the character, and I'm able to keep on writing the character, because for me, she was always a very deep character. Obviously at 14, I didn't know what I'm doing as clearly. I couldn't have articulated some of the things that I was doing. I was fortunate, I was lucky to choose a character and a topic to write about at 14 that could last, that could continue to be that deep for me right to this moment, and to the extent that it's going to be hard for me to let her go and her world go. I know, like you, when I'm reading a series or a book I love, I really passionately want to get to the end of it. I was reading George R.R. Martin's most recent book, and I just guts the thing down in no time at all. And all the time I was reading it, I thought, slow down, because when you finish, it's finished. You have to wait then for him to get his act together and write the next book. I mean, I think the perception used to be, and I used to hear it said, if you don't write this book in the next couple of years, people will stop reading you. And I'm a case in point that they didn't stop reading. So it's, I'm just really gratified that people could, you didn't grow out of me like an old jumper. If I think there's a reason for that, I think it's because she really was, for me, is for me, a very truthful character. She rises very much out of the things that I was thinking about at 14. Why do people do the things that they do? Why are we capable of the most terrible things, we human beings, and also the most beautiful things? And probably underpinning the whole Obernewtyn Chronicles for me was an inquiry, was to find out if I could believe that human beings would evolve ethically and morally. For me, I think if you look at any writer's body of work, you can come up with one or two questions they're trying to ask. For me, that's what a real writer is. A person who asks questions of themselves. At 14, I never, ever in my wildest dreams could imagine this scene right now. I could never imagine it. I didn't even think writers were alive. I thought they were all famous dead people. Because when I grew up, when I was growing up, when I was 14, we didn't see authors. We didn't see authors, we didn't meet them. And so that was my way of translating this. It means gulf between me and the person the shining being who wrote the book. And I really wanted to find people like me. I was a terrible misfit. I didn't fit in. At 14, I thought I was the world's only misfit. At this age in my life, I know that everyone's a misfit sometime between 12 and 17. Everybody is a misfit at some point. And maybe that's why she was also such a strong character, because she rose very much out of my feeling that I wanted to be what I was. I wanted to be the person that I was, but I also wanted to find a place to belong. I wanted to be part of the world. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to belong, but I didn't want to change in order to belong. And I think that's what we feel very much too. Elspeth at 14 was like I was at 14. She's wondering about the world that she lives in. I was wondering about the world too. I was living in the aftermath of bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and wondering whether that was a great thing to do. It seemed like a really, really stupid answer to a question. And yet there were adults making that decision to drop that bomb on a city full of people who didn't know what was being decided, who had no choice in the wars that were happening, in the politics that were involved. There were old people who had no say. There were children, there were babies, and they all died. And looking at that, it seemed to me a terrible thing to do. Like most teenagers, I was growing up in a world that was made of parents' choices, of adults' choices, not my choices. Not just the physical choices they made about where they would live and what they would do, but the emotional choices that led to where they were in life, to whether they were happy or sad or bitter or angry or depressed. You live in that world too when you're growing up, and yet you're 1 second at 14 from inheriting that world and having to hopefully figure out some of the problems. Some interviewer said to me a couple of days ago, adolescents seem to me to see things in a very dark way. And I said, well, what do you expect? You can see what's happening in the world, but you have absolutely no say. You can't make any choices. You can't make any changes. Of course it looks dark to you until the moment you start to inherit the earth. It's probably even darker for a while. But you are, at that point, on the edge of inheriting it all. For me, that's where the series began. Elspeth now, in Ascending, is quite a lot older. Not as old as me. She grew much more slowly. I wish I grew as slowly as she did, because she's still under 20. But I grew a lot older. And yet she does contain those essential questions that I had at 14 and which she still has now. She's a different character, like us all. She's grown. She's softer. She's wiser. She's somewhat more battered. She's less angry, less of a misfit. She's found a place to belong, and she's at the point of taking the final steps in her journey. I probably should just talk a little bit about why The Sending isn't the last book. I hope you're glad that it's not the last book, because when I found that George R.R. Martin didn't finish the last book as he was supposed to, I was really, all I wanted was more. And as long as he gave me some to last me for a while and got on with the next one, I was okay. For me, it will end with the next book. It really will be the final book. I feel that very much as I'm writing, and I feel a sense of completion as I didn't feel when I was writing The Sending. The Sending originally contained almost all of what the Red Queen will contain. What it contained, though, is bared down to the bone. I had to take out two characters. I didn't take the characters out. When I first wrote The Sending, I had to strip those character lines, what happens to them in the story, down to the bone, and that was Dragon and Matthew. When I first wrote that, I almost didn't write about them, because I thought I can't enter into what happens to them without going into it properly. You can't start something you can't finish. So that was one of the things that would have had to have gone. I still would have done it as a short story, but I'm really glad that I'm able to wind it into the final series. When I had finished The Sending, I had something like 1,400 pages, and my editor said, it's too long and you haven't written enough about these things. And I thought, you can't finish the story of Matthew and Dragon there. You can't leave that out. And you can't have that happen in one sentence. And you can't finish the book there. So that's what my editor said. But it's also too long. It was an absolutely unsolvable problem. And I was having hysterics over it, working on the book, thinking, trying and trying. You think with books this size, a person must pad a book. I never pad anything. I spent endless time trying to squish it down to fit it in. And at some point, in Bologna, in a chocolate shop, in hysteria, I burst into tears to my editor, Laura, and I didn't know how to solve it. I didn't know what to do. And she said, what do you want to do? What would your solution be? That's a great editor. That's a great publisher. And she said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I either want 2 more years to try and make it work better as a single book, or I would need to make it into 2 books. And she's the one who allowed me to write it into 2 books. So you can thank her, because I really feel that it's what I want it to be now. The Sending, I then had to go back. Well, of course, then the perception was, well, you must already have a book ready to go. No, I didn't have a book ready to go. What I had was a book that I wanted to turn into a single book, which means I had to move some of the events back, move some of the events forward, change some of the things that I was going to do in the book, because I wanted it to be a complete book. I wanted to, and some very important things happen in this book, some really important things. I had somebody write to me, thank you, the heart, R plus E. And so for those of you who have read the book, you'll know what that means. So I was able to bring this book to a really, to me, an important conclusion, to end some important things, to bring some important story arcs to fruition. And that left me in the perfect state to write the first book. And I can't tell you how much pleasure I'm having now working on The Red Queen, how much pleasure I'm having in being allowed to explore those areas that I wasn't able to explore the first time I wrote it. I fear that it will be somewhat bigger than The Sending, but I'm really glad, I feel that that's a fairly safe thing to tell you. I'm going to read a little bit now. I always feel a bit odd reading from these books because I feel that they're a little bit, they're hard to get a sense of, but with an audience like this I feel that you probably owe favour the series and the characters, so it's okay to read just a little bit of the book to you. I'm going to start where Elspeth is meeting with the Gypsy Irini, and she's asking the Gypsy Irini something in particular. It's just a couple of pages, and I'm going to stop at a horrible spot, hopefully to make you want to read on if you haven't already read it. My heart leapt, but I managed to ask calmly enough, what is that last? I should start at the top of the page. Sorry. Irini shrugged. Swallow says that all that was given the 20 families to do by the director who brought us to this land has been done now, save one last thing. And then we gypsies might cease travelling, or not, as we choose. My heart leapt, but I managed to ask calmly enough, what is that last thing? This, she answered, gesturing to herself and to me. My brother said you would summon me, for you would need something I had. That is why he sent me on ahead to the White Valley. I licked my lips. Did he tell you what I wanted? She shook her head, and I sighed. In truth, I hardly know why I asked you to come and meet me, save to have the chance to thank you for your help and make my apologies for abandoning you when we were trying to escape from Half Moon Bay last time. But now that you've spoken, it seems to me there is something you can do. Ask it, she commanded. It's not a thing to do, but a memory you have that I need, I said. Irini, have you ever seen the statue that your director carved to mark the safe passage agreement with the council? I think it's in Saithwold. It is there, and I have seen it. Can you describe it for me? She frowned. The ancient promises forbid any gypsy, even my brother, from speaking of it. I was taken aback. Then it seems I must travel to Saithwold after all. I hope to avoid the necessity. Irini went on speaking as if I hadn't said a word. I swore on Stonehill that I would aid you in whatever you asked of me, and I do not make such oaths lightly. Irini gave me a sideways look out of her mismatched eyes. There's only one way I can obey the ancient promise and fulfil my oath to you, and that is to show you my memory of the statue. You will permit me to see your memories? I asked. You entered them once before, without asking my permission, she answered dryly. To save your life? Also, without my permission, she reiterated, but mildly. I will summon up a memory of the statue. I'll just jump a couple of bits to say. I was careful to move slowly and to go no deeper than the upper conscious level of her mind. The memory she had summoned up was waiting for me, and even as I prepared to insert a probe into it, I heard her thought that I should enter the memory rather than merely observing it from without. Surprised and not quite clear about her meaning, I projected myself into the memory. I was startled to find that Irini had entered it as well, and so there were two of her, the rememberer who stood by me, and the younger Irini, who was the subject of the memory. We were standing in a moonlit garden, and the younger Irini was looking about her with a frown of deep concentration. She had never been beautiful, but she had an animal vitality and strength and a vividness of expression that made her compelling to watch. She couldn't see us, for we were not part of the memory, and yet the memory itself was so vivid and visceral that I might truly have been standing in a neglected and overgrown garden. "Where's the statue?" I whispered. "There's no need to whisper," the gypsy said, though in fact she spoke softly too. "This is a memory of the first time I saw the statue, and I didn't know exactly where it was. I thought this would be a better memory than later visits to the statue, because I never looked at it so closely again. See." And I won't go on anymore now. Hopefully you'll want to find out what the statue shows, and of course that's one of the clues she's looking for that have been left for her by Cassandra. I might perhaps see if you'd like to ask some questions now. Would anyone like to ask some questions? Those of you who've heard me speak before know I can give a really long answer to a question. It's like the books, I don't know how to do short. What would I choose? I would choose to be able to speak to animals. When I was a kid, I used to think if I practiced, I'd get telepathy. I used to sit behind kids in class and stare at their back and think, pick up the pen. Pick up, trying to will them with the power of my mind. There was a school in Tasmania. I never developed telepathy, although, you know, sometimes when you're sitting in the car and you're thinking of a song, you switch the radio on and that's the song playing. Or the phone rings and you know who called, and that's who's calling. But there was a school in Tasmania who believes I have telepathic powers, because I had a hall of 800 boys all in uniform sitting in front of me, and I was giving a talk and I was trying to give an example of something, and I picked a face out of the sea of faces of one boy and I said, "Now let's just call this boy Michael," and everyone around him went, "Oh!" Because across his forehead it happened to be called Michael. And so at one school in Australia my reputation as a telepath is made. So yeah, that would be the power that I would choose, to talk to animals. And yet I think, you know, you wish for these things, but be careful what you wish for. Imagine what it would be like. My daughter and I were in town in Prague the other day, walking past a little circle where ponies are tied up and walk down. And each of those ponies has its bridle tied unbelievably tightly to its harness, so that it can't lift its head. And that must be excruciatingly painful. And I said to Adelaide, imagine if you really could hear what animals would be saying. And this animal would be saying, "My neck hurts. Please, my neck hurts. Let me stop. Please let me stop." Can you imagine? I can't imagine how heartbreaking. See, I can't imagine. It's too vivid to imagine such a thing. It would be terrible. If you would imagine such a thing. I don't know what it would be like to have those powers, but I think if we did have them, it would change absolutely everything. I mean, sometimes I think, what will change? That's what I'm getting asked again and again. Every radio interview I've had, the radio interviewer at the end says, "So what's the solution? How are we going to save the world?" And I think, is he asking me this seriously? And I always felt like we needed something to lift our spirit. We need another Martin Luther King who can say things that lift your spirit and make you see things differently. But I've started to think, what if it wasn't that? What if it was something like someone invents telepathy, not telepathy, what is it called? Teleporting. What if you could suddenly teleport? There'd be no more passports, no more governments, no more wars, no more privacy, no more anything, because it would make them obsolete. Everything would change. And look at our technology. Someone from the 14th century stepping into this world, how weird and strange it would seem, how differently we live our lives. And who knows what the next step will be. Maybe the answer to humanity's problems is going to be something like some piece of technology that causes a huge paradigm shift. I'm hoping we get rescued by that, because I'm not sure humanity itself is going to, as a body, be able to evolve, although I believe we individually can. See, that was one of those long answers. And there was another question. Yeah.
Would you ever write more about the before times and go back and write more about those places and those stories?
Yeah, I think some of you know from being on those websites that I've already contracted, Laura contracted from me, the Before Time Chronicles, which is 3 books about Cassandra. The first one will be Cassandra in the Before Time, which is the future of our time. The second one will be Cassandra in the Red Land and in the Land. And the final one will be Cassandra in Sador and what happened to her afterwards. So they exist, and I'm really, really excited about writing that series because I know that I will suffer when I can't write in that world anymore. So the nice thing about that book is that I guess I can just say this one thing about it. If Elspeth can dream of the past and the future, then so can other characters, which means people can remember or look forward or imagine Elspeth's time. Because remember, Cassandra and Hannah can see forward into Elspeth's time. That means they must have seen her, which means some of the areas I couldn't go into, like that time when Matthew was away for so long, I can actually enter into parts of this world that I was never able to look at following Elspeth, because I can only stay with her as a character. So it does give me an incredible freedom. But I've also written a number of short stories, well, 2 so far. One is The Black Road, which is about I have to be careful, I don't want to give anything away, a Hannah character. And I've just finished another short story, which will be another Hannah. So again, those stories connect to the Obernewtyn Chronicles. How could I let go of it? It's really difficult for me to let go of that world. Ursula Le Guin, I think some of you know, Ursula Le Guin is my literary heroine. And if I discover a book, when I found that she'd written The Other Wind after all those years, I was so happy. And then I discovered she'd written some short stories about the world of Earthsea, and I was ecstatic. So I hope that the stories that I would write from time to time would be greeted with, I'm hoping, I guess, that some of you long for that world as much as I'm going to miss it. I hope you'll miss it too. Then it means it was really powerful. Any other questions?
What advice do you have for an aspiring author?
Write short stories if you can, because it's a good way to get a short story. A short story is easier for some to take on. If you've written a book, it's much harder to get a book published, especially in this day and age. It's harder to get a book published. So in the craft of learning to be a writer, learn to be a good short story writer. It's the most perfect form. Short stories are very difficult to write. If you can write them, then you've mastered writing. You are a master of writing, and they make me better. Every time I write a short story, I develop and get better as a writer. You can market them too. You can send them off to magazines, and those magazines are read by editors, by writers, by publishers. You can send them into competitions. Those are read by publishers or editors. So you have a lot more flexibility. That's one of the things. The other biggest piece of advice I'll give you is choose the right thing to write about. Like me, by accident, back then when I was 14, I chose a subject that was deep, which meant I could go back to it year after year, which meant I could get better, working on the same story, deepening the same story. Choose to write what you want. Choose to write something that's meaningful for you. Don't write another vampire story because they're selling well. Don't try to be Harry Potter because someone else already did that. Try to write from what you want to write, because that's the deepest way that you'll tap yourself, and it's the most likely way that you'll find something original. Don't listen to anyone who tells you, write a novel about zombies because they're going to be the next big thing. Don't listen, because it's just marketing. It's not real, and it's nothing to do with what being a writer is. Being a real writer is writing what's inside you. A real writer can be given something like a stalwart dwarf, an ethereal elf, a road, a ring or a cup or a magic sword, and a main character, and they will do something with it because they'll delve into themselves and they'll just use that to filter the story through. A bad writer will think, fantasy's doing well, I'll write a fantasy story. Take those characters and they'll just do ordinary things. They'll be like mechanisms wound up. So that's the way to be original. And if there is a next big thing and you might be it, it's not going to come from you trying to copy what somebody else did. So by all means be inspired by writers, but look for your own voice ultimately. And if you are going to do this as a life, you may as well do something you love. And you couldn't love copying somebody else, but you can love doing your own thing. So that's my bit of advice for writers. Someone down here had a question? Yeah? In the whole Obernewtyn Chronicles, or just in the last?
Yeah, the whole lot.
Defining moments. Well, I think the one that I remember most vividly was when I was writing Aisling. I think it's Aisling or The Keeping Place. I can't remember what the battle games happened in. Does anyone remember? Okay. Okay, in Aisling, I expected when I was writing that book, I thought they'd win. I thought, how could they lose? Like they can make people do what they want with their mind. They're empaths. They can do anything, basically. Of course they're going to win. So I really thought they would win. And it was one of the greatest moments in all my writing career when I was writing that scene and they lost. And I just was really, really shocked. Rushton plays out what I felt like in that moment. I thought, how can they have lost? And I realised I'd invented characters that had such a strong ethic that they couldn't do what was required. And I was astounded, and I was really, really happy. And Rushton felt the shock I felt, and Elspeth came back with what I ended up feeling, which was this sense of incredulity and happiness at finding that I'd really invented characters that couldn't do what was required to win a war. They couldn't do it. And I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be good if it would happen to people, that they just couldn't make those choices. And I think there are people who can't make the choices that would be required to win, who couldn't decide to drop the bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And you know, there are millions of moments in science, in history, when people haven't been able to do what they were required to do. And those are the greatest moments. Not the moments when people acted, but when they couldn't act, when they refused to act, when they didn't act, they didn't shoot, they didn't press the button, they couldn't push the trigger. All of those moments. So that for me was a really, really, I still remember talking about it, how vivid it was. I can't remember what book it went in, but I can remember vividly that moment of revelation. I mean, every book that I write, I think I'm on the verge of answering all the questions. And as I write, I think, this is it. This is the answer. And I don't even know whether it's the answer too, but I think this is it. And I get to the end of the book and I think, no, that wasn't it. But this will be it. That's the next thing that I'm... And I think there's that lovely sense of waiting to see in every book that I write. I hope I never stop feeling like that. I think it would be dead. A book would be dead. I heard this lovely story about Tolkien, where someone came up to him writing The Two Towers and said to him, how's that book going that you're writing? And he pushed back his chair and sucked on his pipe a couple of times and said, I don't know, these black riders have just appeared and I don't know what they're about. And I love the idea that you think that they must have figured it all out. But it's not. It's a live thing that you create. It should be. And it starts to take over and do what it wants to do. So that was really a defining moment. That was a good question. Thank you. Maybe... Well, I did sit down with a map and a pair of scissors at one point, and then I decided, I was living in the Czech Republic at one point when I was deciding things about the book, and I decided it would be really nice to have a sea coast in the Czech Republic, and the only way that could happen is if an entire country was eradicated. So there was that moment when I thought, should I? And I was looking at the world, and it's horrifying to admit that I had a sense of what will I do with the world? How will I reshape it? It certainly is set in Europe, and I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that Hannah comes from Australia. And in the short story that I wrote, one of them, you can really see that very much. You can see she's Australian, not in that you mention things, but in how she is in her personality. So yeah, it's set in there would be Romania, there would be Scotland, there would be Middle Europe. So that's and it's so strange that I end up living right in the middle of where I imagined that the book would be set all along. That's really strange. And also, when I started to write the Obernewtyn Chronicles, there was no computer that anybody would use. There was a computer the size of a building, a big, inimical, scary thing that worked like a human brain. It was a scary thing to imagine. And yet, now we have computers we slip in our bag. They don't have quite the same resonance and power, and yet they're more powerful in their own way. So it seems strange that, as I keep saying, technology does seem to keep overtaking us, and life so weirdly sometimes seems to reflect or appear in the books. Maybe that's it. Life mirrors art, art mirrors life, and it keeps happening. It should. It should. Yeah, I think, well, you're inside every character you'd ever create. You're certainly inside the characters, and you certainly have that feeling of energy. I mean, every character you write, be it a beast or an angel, from one end of the spectrum to the other. They have to rise out of you. And while I hope I've never been bestial, I hope I've certainly done things I didn't like that I've done. I've certainly been ashamed of things I've snapped at people, or I've done something I didn't like. So that feeling is what you take far. They're just interesting to me. They're interesting like people are interesting, to find out what they'll do. It's like knowing another human being, meeting someone else, but knowing them from the inside. So there really is a sense of excitement and not knowing quite what this character's going to do. You ride in that character like a vessel, but at the same time you're animating it, but you're also being animated by it. It's an adventure inside every character, I think. Yeah? Yeah? I hope I haven't put you off then. What made me... Yeah. I think the thing that made me write about it was that I was concerned about what was happening to the world, and I thought, would it take an ultimate lesson for human beings to learn, to make us evolve and change? Would it take an ultimate lesson? Something to fracture reality and make us have a huge paradigm shift and see things differently. And for me, back then when I was growing up, as I said, I was worried about those bombs dropping. I mean, people that are my age now are worrying about the seas being destroyed and the melting of the polar caps and global warming. So we're worrying about different things now. But it's the same thing. What are we doing to the world? And if something bad happens and we do survive, would we learn by it? So that's how that sort of came about, really. I studied it as a student and I was interested in it, so I guess it came from that more than anything else.
My friend was wondering if you ever read your books.
Well, I have to reread them every time I write them again. And in fact, it's quite difficult because if you've reread some of them, I've reread many times because of each book that comes. I try to read them only once as a lead-in to the next book. I try really hard not to go back over them because it's really hard to read them. I mean, it's hard for my mind to take them in. I find I'm reading them and my mind just drifts away. It doesn't stay tethered to the page. I'm actually really looking forward to writing Darkbane because I haven't allowed myself... I haven't allowed myself to read those books since I wrote them, and it's a long time since I wrote the last one, and I'm really, really excited at the idea of reading two books that I wrote so long ago that they might feel to me like I didn't write them, that I might read them like a real person. So I'm really excited about that. I'm finding that I'm getting more and more and more questions about that book in particular, which is surprising, given that I've still got one book to go in the Obernewtyn Chronicles, but that's the one I'm getting all the questions about now. So, and I just told Laura that, so you just proved it to me. Green Monkey Dreams will be reprinted later on next year. So that online petition somebody started, I was accused of starting it myself. I didn't. I was also accused of taking so long to write the books of the Obernewtyn series so I could ensure myself an adult audience. It would have been really clever, but it wasn't a strategy. Nothing in my life is a strategy. It's all a happy accident. So yes, Green Monkey Dreams will come out again, and I'm really, really happy to see it out again. And another collection of short stories will come out about the same time. I've only written 2 collections of short stories myself, and they've been separated by, decades. So I'm really excited to have another set come out, and that will happen next year sometime as well. So I'm glad you asked that question. There's always a loophole. There's always a way to change your mind. There's endless possibilities of how to change something if you change your mind, because it all happens very organically. If you want a character to do this, every single time without fail, if you really want to do this and you look backwards, you find it's in the character somehow. It's already there. You do such a lot of writing, beneath the eye line. You do such a lot of writing subconsciously. I don't know how many people are in the audience who are writers, but I know there's one here, Richard Harlan. And I know that that's how you write. I know it because we write 30-page letters to one another when we're angsty over books. And I know he's the same. You do a lot of writing beneath the eye line, subconsciously. So if you want to make a change in a character and you've written it deeply from yourself, it's always in there, the way to do it.
I'm someone that read this a long time ago and then came through, and I'm really looking forward to reading this. But who do you write for when you're writing now? Are you writing for kids, or are you writing for people like me that started a long time ago and that are now,
Grown up?
Do you have an audience in mind, or?
No, I hate to say it in front of an audience. I don't think about you at all when I write. Because what I'm trying to do is, the first part of writing is an inward journey, and it should be an inward journey. If you're a writer sitting there thinking about marketing and the audience, you're making the wrong direction. You're going in the wrong direction. You're going that way, and that's the outward journey. That comes when you've got your writing there. So I'm always writing from the first book to now for myself first. Of course, I'm older too, quite a lot older in fact. I'm older too than when I started, so therefore my preoccupations are different too. Perhaps that's why at this age you can still read it and not be bored or not find, I hope, you haven't read it yet, you just got it in a paper bag, have to assume, that you can keep on reading it because my preoccupations have changed. Yet of course I'm writing things like The Red Wind, and I'm not thinking of an audience there either. What I'm thinking of as best I can is the characters. And to be as faithful as possible. So you were talking about the energy before. To be as faithful as possible to the characters that you've written. You move inside those characters and you look at the world through their eyes. And if the character is 10, then you're looking at the world through the eyes of a 10-year-old. And even though I'm older writing it, hopefully the layering is there. But nevertheless, that's where the story's going to go. And those kids, I mean, at one book of the year this year, so I have to feel like I'm doing something right. But I didn't write it for anybody, even the picture books, the night school. I didn't write those with children in mind. I did write, I do remember very strongly when I was writing, and this is the only series I've ever done this with the Little First series, I do remember very strongly feeling that I wanted that adults who would read it to children or older kids that would read it to younger kids would feel like I felt reading The Mouse and His Child to my daughter. That sometimes words, when you read them, are so beautiful, you just want to say them aloud. And I didn't want to make in-jokes to the adult reading the story. I wanted it to be beautiful to read. I wanted it to be something that would be interesting and pleasurable for them to read. So when I was writing it, I imagined it as something that I would read, as well as being inside the character. And I think that's there in it too. So yeah, I'm always coming from, I'm writing for myself first. I mean, it goes back to what I was saying to you earlier about being a writer. The first person who has to be interested in what you write is you. And so I am the audience. Luckily, I'm still young and I'm also old, so I can cover both ends of the spectrum. So I should stop so we can get to the next one.
Thank you so much.
Those that started Obernewtyn many years ago, there's a glass of wine. Now, Isobelle will be very happy to sign. Yes, I know we've got to do. Yes, I won't. You're a bit of a nagger tonight, aren't you? We'd like to, if we could, before Isobelle goes to the back to sign copies, where Megan's just waved her hand, is a table. we'd like you to make your way down and just unveil the book that's there. Thank you very much for coming. We hope to see you again.